there may have been a single moment in human history when our species came within a few thousand births of disappearing forever. Not because of a meteor impact, not because of a supervolcano, but because the systems that kept ancient humans alive began collapsing faster than any population could adapt to survive them. Tonight, we are following the genetic trail of one isolated group of people whose DNA may preserve the last surviving echoes of human species that vanished from this earth tens of thousands of years ago. A population so genetically unusual that scientists were forced to rethink the entire structure of the human family tree. Because hidden inside their cells is biological evidence that humanity never survived alone, and that the world our ancestors walked into was far stranger, far more crowded, and far more dangerous than any textbook has ever told us. The human family tree was never truly a tree. It was a collapsing forest of competing survival systems, and most of that forest is already gone. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from right now, and tell me something else while you are at it. What do you think actually kept Homo sapiens alive when every other human species disappeared? Was it intelligence, violence, cooperation, or something far more fragile than all of those things combined? Because for most of human existence, survival was never the normal outcome. Extinction was. 65,000 years ago, the entire non-African human population may have descended from a founding group smaller than a modern high school graduating class. Population geneticists studying the diversity of the human genome outside Africa have identified an extreme bottleneck during the original out-of-Africa migration. The surviving population may have numbered only a few thousand breeding individuals at its most vulnerable point. One epidemic moving through that group, one prolonged drought collapsing the food supply, one failed migration corridor closing at the wrong season, and the entire expansion likely ends before it begins. Humanity survived on a statistical edge so narrow that it barely registers as plausible. And when those early humans finally pushed into Eurasia, they did not find empty land waiting for them. Neanderthals had already occupied Europe and Western Asia for 400,000 years. They were not primitive creatures stumbling blindly through the cold. They buried their dead with apparent ritual. They cared for group members too injured to hunt. They engineered composite tools from stone and bone and wood. They survived glacial climates that the first Homo sapiens entering Europe had never experienced in their evolutionary history. The uncomfortable reality buried in the fossil record is this: Neanderthals may have been better adapted to Ice Age Eurasia than the modern humans who eventually replaced them, which means their extinction cannot be easily explained by raw intelligence or superior cognition. The survival gap between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis was almost certainly far thinner than the story we tell ourselves. And farther east, another human lineage had already spread across environments stretching from the frozen Siberian taiga all the way to tropical forests, separated by open ocean. Ancient DNA now confirms that Denisovans carried specific adaptations for altitude tolerance, immune function, and environmental extremes. One Denisovan-derived gene still helps Tibetan populations survive in low-oxygen conditions today, 50,000 years after the species that produced it ceased to exist. These were not evolutionary failures. They were extraordinary survivors whose systems eventually ran out of time. In 2010, a single finger bone pulled from the sediment of Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia rewrote the known boundaries of human prehistory. Before that discovery, nobody had any reason to believe the Denisovans existed at all. There was no name for them, no chapter in any textbook, no place reserved for them in any model of human evolution. And even now, after years of intensive research, science still cannot reconstruct their full physical appearance with any confidence. We have a finger bone, a handful of teeth, a few skull fragments, and a jawbone recovered from the Tibetan plateau. That is the nearly complete physical record of a human population that may once have occupied one of the largest geographic ranges of any hominin species ever to walk the earth. Their genome tells the story that their fossils cannot. The Denisovans ranged from the frozen Altai Mountains all the way down through tropical Southeast Asia, adapting to radically different climates, ecosystems, and disease environments across thousands of miles of terrain. That kind of range requires enormous adaptive flexibility. It requires populations capable of surviving conditions that would collapse most other species within a few generations. And this is where the emotional weight of extinction really begins to land. Because the Denisovans did not fail. They endured for hundreds of thousands of years across some of the most demanding environments on the planet. What eventually happened to them was not defeat in any simple sense. Climate systems shifted, migration corridors closed. Populations became too fragmented to maintain the genetic and social networks necessary for long-term survival. A species can survive hunger. A species can survive cold. But when isolation removes the mathematics of reproduction and innovation simultaneously, even highly adapted populations begin sliding toward a threshold they cannot recover from. The Denisovans crossed that threshold, or almost crossed it, because fragments of them did survive. Inside us. When Stanford researchers analyzed DNA from populations across every inhabited continent in 2009, nearly every group clustered exactly where the models of human migration predicted they should. Europeans clustered with Europeans. East Asians clustered with East Asians. African populations showed the deepest and most diverse genetic roots of all, exactly as the Out of Africa framework predicted. The data was clean, organized, and structurally satisfying in the way that confirms a scientific model rather than challenging it, except for one group. One population sat outside the expected structure almost entirely, and the researchers could not make it fit no matter how they adjusted their analysis. The Andamanese, indigenous islanders living on a small chain of islands in the Bay of Bengal between India and Myanmar, carried a genetic divergence from other modern human populations, stretching back roughly 50 to 70,000 years. That depth placed their ancestors among the very first humans to leave Africa, members of the original migration wave that began spreading east across southern Asia before any other population in the non-African world. And unlike virtually every other early population descended from that first migration, the Andamanese were never overwritten by the waves of expansion that followed. This is one of the most critical details in the entire story. Most modern human populations are complex layered mixtures produced by thousands of years of migration, agricultural expansion, conquest, and trade, with ancient genetic signals repeatedly diluted or erased by larger incoming populations. But the Andaman Islands sat in biological isolation, and isolation preserved something that had vanished almost everywhere else on Earth. When researchers looked deeper into the Andamanese genome, expecting ancient but recognizable modern human DNA, they found something that should not have been there. Substantial Denisovan ancestry, thousands of miles from where Denisovan fossils had ever been discovered, sitting inside a population that had been sealed off from outside contact for 50 millennia. The Denisovan signal inside Andamanese DNA created an immediate and serious problem for every existing model of prehistoric human migration. The Andamanese had been genetically isolated for tens of thousands of years. No major population movement from the north or east could have introduced Denisovan ancestry into them after that isolation began, which meant the ancestry had to have entered their lineage before the isolation started. The ancestors of the Andamanese must have encountered Denisovans somewhere in Southeast Asia during the earliest phase of the Out of Africa migration, roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, which meant Denisovans were not a small, geographically limited population living in distant Siberian caves. They had expanded deep into tropical Asia, possibly across island chains separated by open ocean, long before modern humans arrived. Then, in 2018, researchers made the picture even more complex. The Denisovan ancestry found in Papuan and Aboriginal Australian populations did not come from a single Denisovan source. It came from at least two deeply separated Denisovan lineages that had diverged from each other more than 280,000 years earlier. Two distinct populations, evolving separately across enormous spans of time, each mixing with different waves of modern humans at different moments and in different locations across Asia. The human family tree was never a clean branching structure. It was a tangled survival network of overlapping human populations repeatedly meeting, separating, competing, and merging under extreme environmental and climatic pressure. And buried even deeper inside the Andamanese genome, researchers found fragments that matched nothing in any database science had assembled, not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, not any known modern or archaic human population. Ghost lineages, DNA from a human group that has never been physically identified, never confirmed in the fossil record, never located in any archaeological site anywhere on Earth. Somewhere in deep prehistory, another population of humans encountered the ancestors of the Andamanese, lived alongside them long enough to produce children together, and then disappeared so completely that the only surviving proof of their existence is replicating silently inside the cells of a few hundred living people on a chain of tropical islands. This is where the story stops feeling like a genetics lecture and starts feeling like something much harder to process. Because ghost lineages force a confrontation with a possibility that most of us are not prepared to sit with, human history may be almost entirely invisible. Not because it never happened, but because extinction erased the physical evidence faster than geological time could preserve it. Rainforests decompose bone rapidly. Rising sea levels have drowned the coastlines where the earliest out-of-Africa migrations almost certainly traveled. Tropical environments that likely sheltered the largest and most diverse populations of ancient humans are precisely the environments where fossil preservation is poorest. Entire human worlds may have lived, spread, adapted, flourished, and vanished without leaving a single recognizable physical trace behind. And the most haunting part of that thought is how ordinary their disappearance probably appeared at the time it was happening. Not apocalypse, not a sudden catastrophic ending, just accumulation. A smaller hunting territory this season than the last. A harsher climate cycle that reduces the births that survive infancy. A generation that loses critical environmental knowledge because not enough elders survive to pass it forward. A fragmentation of social networks until the cooperative systems that sustained innovation and adaptation simply stop functioning at sufficient scale. A population weakens slowly, invisibly, until mathematical recovery becomes impossible, and then the silence closes over everything they ever were. Researchers now increasingly believe that Homo sapiens survived this gauntlet not because individual humans were dramatically more intelligent or physically superior to every competitor, but because human social systems scaled further under pressure than any other species managed. Larger alliance networks, longer distance exchange of knowledge, materials, and mates, greater capacity for symbolic communication that preserved survival knowledge across generations, more flexible behavioral adaptation between radically different environments. The species that survived may have been the species that stayed connected longest when everything around it was pulling populations apart. When British colonial administration established a permanent settlement on the Andaman Islands in 1858, ancient survival systems that had functioned continuously for tens of thousands of years collided with the modern world, and the collision was catastrophic in ways that nobody at the time fully understood. The Andamanese carried essentially no immunity to the pathogens that outsiders brought with them. Measles, influenza, and syphilis moved through populations whose immune systems had been calibrated against a completely different disease environment, one that had been sealed off from global pathogen circulation since the last ice age. Within decades of sustained contact, entire communities had collapsed. The great Andamanese population fell from several thousand people to fewer than 50 survivors. Not because of direct violence, not because of deliberate extermination, but because of biology operating with the mechanical indifference that characterizes every epidemic that has ever crossed an immunity gap. This is what extinction actually looks like in practice. Not cinematic catastrophe, not armies and fire. A cough in a crowded settlement. a fever that the traditional healers have no framework to treat, a village that simply stops moving one season and never starts again. The same pattern had already devastated indigenous populations across the Americas after European contact, and it played out again in the Andamans with the same brutal arithmetic. The isolation that had preserved these populations for tens of thousands of years had simultaneously made them catastrophically vulnerable the moment that isolation ended. The very system that kept them alive became the mechanism of their collapse when the conditions changed. Today, only a few hundred Andamanese people survive across several distinct groups. Each of them carries irreplaceable genetic information from populations that no longer exist anywhere else on Earth, including signals from human species that have been biologically extinct for 40,000 years. The archive is real, it is living, and it is extraordinarily fragile. The Sentinelese understood something through generations of accumulated contact experience that modern civilization consistently struggles to recognize. Proximity to the outside world is lethal. North Sentinel Island sits surrounded by shallow coral reefs that have historically deterred large vessels from approaching. The Sentinelese have maintained violent rejection of outside contact for as long as any historical record reaches. Arrows, thrown rocks, and in recent decades the bodies of outsiders killed on the beach. To observers without context, this posture can appear irrational, even primitive. Anthropologically, it may represent one of the most consistently successful survival strategies ever maintained by any human population in the modern era. Every Andamanese group that accepted sustained outside contact experienced catastrophic demographic collapse within a few generations. The Sentinelese, who accepted none, are still alive. In 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chow illegally landed on the island after a series of approaches in preceding days. He was killed shortly after making contact. The Indian government declined to pursue charges against the tribe and declined to attempt recovery of the body because any operation capable of reaching the island would have risked introducing modern pathogens into a population with essentially no acquired immunity to contemporary disease. The calculus was straightforward. The biological risk of contact outweighed the legal and cultural imperatives to retrieve remains. The Sentinelese are the only Andamanese population whose genome has never been studied. We do not know what extinct lineages survive inside them. We do not know whether they carry ghost ancestry that has vanished from every other population on Earth. We may never know, because the survival strategy that kept them alive is precisely the barrier that makes scientific study impossible. Their hostility is not chaos. It is adaptive memory, refined across generations of evidence that contact with the outside world destroys the people it touches. Geneticists are now running systematic searches through the genomes of isolated populations across the world, specifically looking for the kind of ghost ancestry signals found in the Andamanese, Amazonian communities with limited outside contact, highland populations in Papua New Guinea, remnant hunter-gatherer groups across Central Africa, and increasingly, they are finding similar signals in all of these places. Small fragments of ancestry from human populations that left no confirmed fossils, no identified tools, no named sites in any archaeological record. Genetic echoes from worlds that vanished before anyone was writing things down. This means the planet our ancestors entered after leaving Africa was almost certainly far more populated with different kinds of humans than any model built before the ancient DNA era ever suggested. For most of prehistory, Homo sapiens may have been simply one branch inside a much larger and more complex ecosystem of intelligent human populations, some of whom competed directly with our ancestors, some of whom shared knowledge and territory and reproduction across species boundaries that we still do not fully understand, and many of whom disappeared so completely that only molecular traces remain, carried forward through tens of thousands of years of human reproduction into the bodies of people alive today. This changes the emotional meaning of human survival at a fundamental level, because modern humans are not biologically isolated from the species that came before us. We carry Neanderthal immune genes that still influence how our bodies respond to certain pathogens. We carry Denisovan adaptations that help some populations survive conditions that would be fatal without them. We carry fragments of unnamed populations whose contributions to our biology we have not yet fully cataloged. The species alive today may not be the winner of human evolution in any clean sense. We may simply be the last surviving network assembled from the genetic legacies of everyone else who disappeared. There are fewer than 800 Andamanese people alive on Earth right now. Inside their cells exists a biological archive that is older than agriculture, older than any city ever built, older than any system of writing that human civilization has ever produced. Their genome contains evidence of migrations and encounters and extinctions stretching back to the earliest phase of humanity's expansion across the planet, preserved not in stone or clay or any physical medium that humans chose to use, but in the molecular structure of living cells replicating themselves in the bodies of a few hundred people on a chain of tropical islands in the Indian Ocean. And that archive is genuinely fragile in ways that are difficult to fully absorb. A single epidemic moving through one of these communities, a catastrophic storm making landfall at the wrong moment, a policy reversal by the Indian government opening the islands to outside contact without adequate preparation. Any of these things could initiate a collapse that no subsequent recovery effort could reverse, erasing genetic signals that survived the last ice age, that survived 40,000 years of human expansion and agricultural revolution and colonial contact, that carried the molecular memory of human species no longer present anywhere else on the planet, gone, permanently, because there is no other copy. The forces that destroyed every other human species that ever existed have not gone away. Disease, isolation, environmental disruption, population collapse, the slow arithmetic of systems failing faster than adaptation can compensate. Those forces are still operating. They always were. The Andamanese survived because their islands protected them from the pressures that erased every other population carrying their ancestry. But that same protection left them permanently exposed to sudden disruption in ways that larger, more connected populations are not. Human survival was never inevitable. For most of our history, humanity existed far closer to extinction than the story we tell about ourselves ever acknowledges. One failed migration at the wrong moment. One climate shift that closes a corridor for a century too long. One epidemic crossing an immunity gap into a population too small to absorb the losses. And Homo sapiens disappears beside the Neanderthals and the Denisovans and the unnamed ghost populations, leaving nothing behind except perhaps a few molecular fragments inside whatever species came after us. But somehow, one fragile network held together long enough, and inside the cells of a few hundred people on isolated islands at the edge of the Indian Ocean, the human species that did not survive are still there, silent, waiting in the dark of every replicating nucleus for someone to finally understand that they were human too, and that their disappearance was not inevitable, and that ours is not either. If this changed how you think about human survival, you are exactly who Prehistoric Shadows exists for. Subscribe, because next week we are going deeper into the genetic evidence of another population whose DNA suggests a chapter of human history that mainstream science is still not ready to fully explain. We will see you there.